So what I'm going to talk about today is the creation of a marine park and a little bit about 20 years of work that I've been doing up there. This was kind of tough to put together. I've got hours and hours and hours of material and photos and etc. So as I sat down to think about what I was going to say, it kind of came down to, well, what do I talk about? Do I talk about the GIS mapping, the stuff that I do? Do I talk about the birds? Where do I go? And I started thinking a little bit, and just last year, the two places I'm talking about, Roebuck Bay and 80 Mile Beach, were designated as marine parks, which is kind of like a national park in the US. Maybe better state park, somewhere in between. But they're protected, and this has been something that we've been talking about doing for 20 years and never thought it was going to happen. All right, never thought for a minute it would happen. All right, and I got there last October for a month of research, and they were. And I've got a little tiny piece of this. All right, I can't take a whole lot of credit, but I can take a little bit, and that's cool. All right, just a little where we are. So we've got Australia here. Australia is almost exactly the same size as the lower 48. All right, so Perth would be LA and Sydney would be Atlanta, more or less. And we're up here in the corner at Roebuck Bay and 80 Mile Beach. We're well above the Tropic of Capricorn. In fact, we had one day in October it hit 115 with about 100% humidity. It sucked. So how do we get to this point? Well, we did a lot of research. We did a lot of community outreach. And this guy right here, who's the person that pulls us together every few years, and he's the guy I have to give most of the credit to. All right, he got us all together the first time. He kept pulling us together. He's got everybody and their dog involved. Yeah, we had a dog this time. Yeah, it's truly amazing. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the research we do, a little bit about the process from going from unknown to a marine park. All right, we're concerned with some really extensive mudflats. All right, within Roebuck Bay, they've got a 10-meter vertical, 32 feet tidal range between a spring low tide and a spring high tide. It's nice and slow. It doesn't come rushing in and out like, say, the Bay of Fundy or a place like that. It comes in nice and slow. So we've got mud flats that are up to about 4 miles between high and low tide. All right. In Roebuck Bay, there are about 200 square kilometers of mud. 80 Mile Beach is closer to 400 square kilometers. And birds. This is kind of the sexy end of thing. Birds, 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 more birds. 7th most populous site in the world for migratory wading birds. And if you're looking at the video that was up there, you just saw swarms of birds. I look at this and I see tons of little brown birds, right? I sent this photo to one of my ornithologist buddies, and he's like, oh yeah, can't you see those? Now, he can count them and do all the species, so we've got people like this out there, not just people like me that go, birds. Yeah, they're everywhere. There are hundreds of thousands of them. Great knots, red knots, stints, plovers, tattlers. They all look kind of the same. They got long legs and long beaks. They eat stuff that lives in the mud. All right. They come in various sizes, various types of shapes of beak, various lengths, but in effect, they're all eating stuff on the mudflats. It all started in the early 90s with Grant, who had heard about all these birds and started wondering about what the birds were eating and started to get interested in these mudflats and the birds. And we're talking remote Australia. It was only the 80s that this area was sort of discovered as a bird site. I mean, sure, the locals knew there were a lot of birds, but it kind of got recognition only in the 80s. So in the 90s, people started actually doing some work. Okay? And you've got a bunch of questions. You know, why are the birds here? Where did they come from? What are they eating? What's unique about this area? I mean, why are they right here? What do we need to do to protect them? What are the greatest hazards? And we can go on and on and on and get very kind of academically esoteric. But basically it boils down to, why are the birds here? What are they eating? What are they doing? And then where do they go? Right. So we've got a bunch of questions. We've got this Australian guy who has a bachelor's degree. That's his highest qualification. He worked for, think kind of Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, BLM, all rolled into one agency. So government agency. And he's interested. What do we do? Well, of course, the first thing you do is you bring in the Dutch. I mean, everybody knows that. Why the Dutch? Because the world experts on migratory wading birds and critters that live in the mud that birds eat happen to be Dutch. All right? And the first thing they did was sent a gal named Ingrid down there to check it out, see what was going on. I think she was a grad student. You know, when there's something very far out in the weeds, potentially dangerous, send a grad student. All right? So Ingrid came down and checked it out, and she has a snail named after her. It would be the Ingrid eating snail. All right, it's, you know, it's a snail, right? Everybody's seen a snail. They live on mostly bird poop, but anything decomposing on the surface. And they're everywhere. If you stop moving on the mud, it's like all of a sudden there are 40 of them creeping towards you. Now let's face it, if you can't get away from a snail, you've got more problems than the snail. But unknowingly, Ingrid sat down in the mud, had lunch, you know, took some notes, and then got up and had to pluck snails off of her legs. All right, thus Ingrid eating snails. I've never met Ingrid, she never came back. All right, however, a bunch of other Dutch started showing up, including the guy who runs the, oh dang, the name escapes me, but the World Migratory Shorebird Group, whatever. He's got species named after him. Well, one. All right. So there was enough there that basically Turnus and his wife Petra, and then the benthic invertebrate guy named Mark, kind of came down. We got all this fired up. Our first sort of expedition was in 97. Okay, I was involved in that. It was interesting. I went to a lunch for the dean had for new faculty at Curtin University, whereupon I met a couple of geologists. They were oil geologists, very boring. All right, but they went back to the department and said, hey, there's a guy over here in spatial sciences, but his background's geology and he knows how to make maps. I got 3 phone calls the next day. All right, one was an economic geologist, one was the guy doing this, and the other one was a tectonics guy. No women in the geology department there, not permitted. And anyways, hey, can you make some map for us? Sure, I'd love to. Where's this field area? We just need you to make maps. And I'm like, I just need to go in the field. I won. And I got to head up there. And that's kind of what we're after. I had a PhD student working on the sedimentology and hydrology, particularly the freshwater, saltwater interface down in the mud. Yeah, we've had a lot of students over the years. And the BIMS is Bay Intertidal Mapping. You'll notice 2006 was HellBIM. Norovirus went through the camp that year. Not fun. All right, but what do we have? 2, 4, 6, 8 fairly large expeditions. And by large, I mean 50 to about 120 people involved. All right, so lots of people. Plus there's also a group of people looking at the birds. This is just pretty much the benthic crowd. And we do monthly sampling in one area. So we're trying to understand the hydrology, geochemistry, sedimentology, benthic invertebrates, and birds, stitch it all together, use the information for management plans, okay, of which there were none. Ultimately, we have to go global with these things because these guys migrate. They all nest up in Siberia. And I'll talk about that very, very briefly. Who cares? Well, the birds are the sexy end of it. Lots of people like birds. All right, they're not so excited about the clam that lives in the mud, except that that happens to be bird food. All right, so we're here to figure out the basic scientific understanding of the components that make up the bird's ecosystem, and then keep going. Lots of people. Had 110 this year, or 100 this year, 110 in Strobim would have been 02. We bring them in from all over the world. There aren't just the Dutch, obviously Australians, me, Brits, French, Germans, Luxembourgers, Chinese. We pull them in from all over. One of the really cool parts is we've got a lot of, I refer to them as repeat offenders. All right, a third of the people there every time I know. Including this year, we had a 91-year-old, an 88-year-old, and an 81-year-old. And I'll talk about those three a little bit. We're getting the local groups. The BBO is the Broome Bird Observatory, where we stay. EK is Environs Kimberley, a local environmental group. And DPAW is Department of Parks and Wildlife. And then a bunch of Aboriginal groups, which this year we had a lot of success getting them involved. Sometimes not so much. We're looking at the south end of the flyway. Okay, a bunch of exciting birds. And again, they're nesting up here in Siberia. This is their one stop in the Yellow Sea, which is actually kind of a huge problem, but I gave that talk last week, so we're not going to talk about the Yellow Sea today. And then they come down here into Australia to get fat. I mean, that's what they do. They come down here to eat, so they got enough energy to get back to Siberia and breed. All right. One of the cool things, and this arrow isn't that accurate, but there's a group of, I believe it was the bar-tailed godwits, that actually flies from Alaska nonstop to Greenland, New Zealand, one of those lands. South Pacific, North Atlantic, whatever. All right. But they all go through the Yellow Sea and then further north. But now we're going to go to Roebuck Bay. I've got a couple satellite images here. One at close to low tide, one at close to high tide. This distance of mud here is about 3 kilometers. It's close to low, it's not quite. I need a pointer. We stay, this is the town of Broome. Anybody's familiar with Australia, and then Cable Beach is over here. This is that perfect white sand beach with gentle rollers and people lying on the beach soaking up sun. Okay, it's like the world's best place to do that. You don't want to swim because everything in the water will kill you. All right? You don't want to go inland because everything there will kill you too. All right, but right on that stretch of beach, okay, we stayed at the Broome Bird Observatory, which is located right about here. Fairly rough, stayed in camps or in tents, etc. So a couple of the pictures you're going to see are from people standing right about here looking down this way. Okay, these are mangroves, fringing the red. There's a fringe of mangroves in this area and mangroves over here. And yeah, and there's a view. Y'all saw the video I started with. This was something we had a professional group in filming us this year. I don't remember where that all went, but it was some kind of sort of hype for the new parks that they were putting together. There's a reddish sand beach, sort of, right at high tide, or really right above high tide. And then the mud just goes forever. Okay, miles and miles and miles of mud. The mud you're looking at in this area has only been sampled by a foot team once. And from personal experience, the mud's this deep, which is why we only did it once. All right. That was a tough day. Apparently right now there's a 4-meter croc living somewhere in here. That's a big croc. Global warming has expanded the range of the saltwater croc, and they've made it down to this area. This year, all of the sampling in this area was either done from a boat or from a hovercraft. Mostly, well, 2 reasons. One is you could sample a whole lot more, and 2, it was a lot safer. Okay, here's more of a high tide image. This is a little further up on the middle of the north coast. But again, you got a little bit of beach, nice red cliffs, and then at low tide it turns to mud. All right, this is a true statement. Roebuck Bay is the richest known intertidal mudflat in the world in terms of number of organisms and number of species. 80 Mile Beach just to the south is number 2. And yes, that's an orange in his mouth. Yep. Okay, however, Grant gets enthusiastic. Oh, there's one of our sampling teams after a day in the mud. He also says this, it's a lie. It's a bald-faced lie, we're number 2. There's a program in the Dutch Waddenzee that is fully funded by, I think, BP, that has a lot of oil rigs in the Waddenzee. And let's just say that BP can fund a whole lot more sampling than whatever we can scrounge together. Okay? Yeah, which is one of the reasons we have all these Dutch involved. Okay? So what do? We've got the preliminary tasks of hustling funding, writing grants, and outright begging. Okay? Grant manages to get people to show up for nothing and donate time and equipment. I have no idea how this guy does it. He might be an expert thief. We're not sure. All right. We're heavily reliant on volunteers, in-kind donations. We've had people bring hovercraft, across the continent, run them around for a couple of weeks, and then bring them back for gas money. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. We have to prepare for the sampling, which involves generating a sampling grid, various maps, all right, putting together all the equipment. There's volunteer training. And then there's the part where I get into how we became a marine park, all right, which really has to do with coordinating with the videographers, town events, mini conferences, just getting word out to anyone and everyone, and basically hyping the place. And if you get enough people worked up, you get enough interest, eventually things happen. Yeah, here's a training session. This was back in '02. There are, I think, 3 CW students in this picture. The joy of going in June is that you can bring students. The joy of going in October is they'd have to take the quarter off. Yeah, and you can see the boom mic, and there's a whole nother video out there from 2002 with what we're doing. All right. Me, I do maps and data. All right, that's my job. I sit inside and I pound on a keyboard. All right, this last trip, I estimate I made somewhere around 300 maps in the 3-week period I was working on it. And then I get out in the field as well. I wrote code. All right, this will generate a set of XY coordinates on a regular grid. Okay. It was very exciting, believe me. Also that I could put dots on a map. All right. The blue dots are every 200 meters, which is what we sampled across the north end of the bay. And the green dots are every 400 meters, which was the southern part of the bay. We split that up because the north is where all the people are and most of the birds. We need better data. To the south, it's harder to get there. There isn't as much going on. So, yeah. And then I make a custom map for every team that goes out in the field. All right. The dots they're supposed to get to, we've got identifiers. They got a little spreadsheet with, this was row 28, column 54, south grid, for example. And then the GPS coordinates. People would type those coordinates into their GPS and off they'd go. All right. We usually had somewhere between 5 and 10 teams a day going out. Here's another one. This is that super muddy area. This was a hovercraft run. trying to get some low tide stuff. These are the buckets everybody gets. There's a sieve, there's a corer, there's two buckets to carry stuff. Somebody's in charge of setting up basically the clipboard and making sure all the sample labels are in there and the GPSs are charged and etc. So whoever the team lead is grabs their thing and off they go. Right? There's a lot of sort of coordination work that goes into this. Then we head out there. All right, we start by shoving the core into the mud 3 times, dumping it into sieve, and rinsing all the mud out of it. You're left with shell fragments and anything large enough for a bird to eat. And of course, we don't care about the shell fragments. Okay. This photo right here, I'm standing up. I'm not kneeling. That was in the muddy zone. All right. You ended up a mess. This is 80 Mile Beach. You can see the beach off in the distance. But a bunch of cores, sieve them through. We also would take a surface sediment sample as well. So we didn't forget the dirt, Carl. Okay. This was the muddy area. There were sandy areas. Okay. I also have one other thing to talk about. I was on this team. This guy right here was the dean of the graduate school at Cambridge University. His undergraduate room was the same room that Sir Isaac Newton used. He shared a tent site with me. He actually paid as kind of like an Earthwatch volunteer to come down and help us out. I don't remember her name. She saw an ad in the local paper that we're looking for volunteers. She was on holiday and thought this would be cool to spend a few days out in the mud. And this would have been 02. This is Mavis. She was back this year. She's 91. So 02, so that's what, 14 years ago? My math is correct. So yeah, she's out there in the field at 77, taking samples. She's been at every one of these things. You do not mess with Mavis, ever. Just, yeah. Here's a picture of our hovercraft team this year. We got a guy sampling, a guy sieving, a guy in the boat taking notes, and then we've got the hovercraft driver taking a picture of the other person taking a picture. All right. We actually hired him and his boat this year to come up here, and in the end, he donated a couple extra days. You know, we got him convinced that this was cool enough that as long as you pay for the gas, I'll stick around for a couple days, which really saved us at the next place because it was muddy. We also sampled from a boat, which is how they do it in the Netherlands. And in fact, that guy is one of our Dutch cadre. The guy was a sampling animal. And you basically get your boat into shallow water. You had a core on the end of this thing. You shoved it in, you sealed it off, you popped it out, you sieved it. Same basic thing. All right, he could do more. He was just an animal. All right, and at the end of the day, what you looked like really depended on where you sampled. All right, this group, which includes 2 CW students, these 2, and Matt from nowhere who shows up, eats, and disappears. That was a sandy day. Sun was out, it was beautiful. All right, this was this year on a muddy day, and I believe they were on a hovercraft team in the deep mud. And they just came back coated. Yeah. Couple of pretty pictures. Okay, a little mud skipper. All right, you'd see them obviously in the muddy areas. All kinds of crabs, including the one that kind of made the cover of the ad. This is a, I think it's a ghost crab, and it's eating basically a little bivalve, a little clam. All right, we don't like this because that clam is bird food and the crab is evil. All right, we weren't sure about that. But these guys were like this big and just kind of scuttling around all over the place. You kind of chase them. It was kind of fun. All right, got to have a cute little hermit crab. This is a hairy crab. If you squint, I've got an eye here and an eye here, and the 2 front claws here. The back legs, you can't see them in the mud unless they move. Anemones, all right, he managed to catch this flatfish You can see both eyes are on the top, and its face is kind of mutated so that the jaw is all on top. Another Dutch guy. They're everywhere. All right. Octopi, we run into those. This is a sea snake. I put this in here specifically for Dan, who's off doing avalanche training or something. All right. This is the kind of snake that it bites you and you die. You don't even need to talk about it. We run into these. I think we saw 2 or 3 this year. We usually see a couple of them. All right, it's in a bed of linear seagrass. Complicated name. We see turtles all the time. Frogs everywhere. All right, brittle stars. They're hard to get out like this, but I've pulled out samples where what you had left was like 80% brittle star legs. I mean, these things are, you can get dozens within one little core. And their legs can be like this long. So obviously they disintegrate pretty quick, but they're everywhere. And then we run into little worms that the birds are also eating. I got a story about the worm guy coming up when we get to a picture of him. But yeah, we had a worm guy. Okay, a couple pictures of these. I've only got about 200 worm photos if you're into them. They're really cool under the microscope. This guy's that long. Quick little snack for a bird. So we go out there, we take these samples, we bring them back to the bird observatory, or if we're at 80 Mile Beach, we stay at a cattle station to sort them, ID them, type them all into databases, make maps, make reports, run, do all that academic stuff. All right, here we are sorting. So this tray is what we bring back. And you dump it in there and you pick out anything that moves. And then you hand the tray to the next person so they double check your work. All right, this guy right here is the guy that organizes us and keeps us going. This guy is, we made geology faculty here? No, he has a degree in geology from CWU and went down there in 06 with his father, who could fix anything. He got the MacGyver Award. Then we go into the lab, and you're going to see these people. This is the 88-year-old this time. This is the 81-year-old this year. All right, this guy, you'll see him in the next photo. To ID them. There's Lizette at 88. She spent all day, every day, staring into a microscope, identifying stuff. It was amazing. Shirley's right here at 81. There's Mavis at 91. These guys are a couple of local rangers, members of the local Aboriginal group. All right. This old guy right here is the young guy in the previous photo. He knows every benthic invertebrate by its first name and who its mom was. All right, that's him back here in the back. And that's me in the corner, hunched over a computer, because that's what I do. All right, we'll get into this guy here. He's nothing but trouble. Okay. I'd make daily progress maps. Keep track of where we've been, what we've done. Okay. But how do we know what the birds are eating? Okay. This is where you really don't want to be an ornithologist. You go out with a spoon and you pick up bird poop and you put it in a little jar, and then you come back and look at it under a microscope to see if you can figure out what the bits are. All right. This is Danny. He's the guy that IDs all the birds for me. And apparently the trick is to actually catch the bird pooping, so you know what kind of bird it is, and then beat the snails. Because they literally show up within seconds of anything being available to eat. Okay, this was just this trip. We sampled, 8 and 5, 13, almost 1,400 sample sites over 3 weeks in October. We ID'd and measured about 32,500 individual invertebrates. Some to species level, some not nearly to species level. We run into new species every time I'm there. I mean, it's a worm. It's not that exciting, but it's still kind of cool to be part of, a group discovering new species. And then we've built up this huge database, which the Park Service, now that there's a Park Service involved, all right, is going to be using in all their management plans. In fact, our group is trying to sort of be the subcontractor that does all the sampling for the benthic stuff for the park. So we'll see how that works out. Some of the things we see. This is linear seagrass, the stuff you saw with the snake. We've got 97, 02 up top, 06, and then 16. And you can see in 02 there's no seagrass. Okay. What happened was a hurricane came through. It just tore everything out. All right, and you can see it starting to recover by 06, and more or less probably about back to where it was in 97 by 16. There used to be dugong in the bay. There hasn't been for a while, but the dugong feed on the seagrass. So if the seagrass gets established, maybe we can get dugong back. All right, these are, let's see, it's Siliqua, which is a very thin shelled bivalve. You can see it shows up in one very specific place, which is the heavy mud. All right, and you can see that it was gone in 16, and we don't know why. All right, important bird food. So birds that feed in this area are eating these, and there's no chow now. All right, we have, like I said, we have no idea why. Okay, however, Talina, another bivalve, which shows up in more of the mixed silty areas, there's more of it. All right, and the birds that feed on this may be doing a bit better. All right, so we can just start, these are some of the things that just come out from looking at a handful of maps in the field. All right, there's the bloody cockle, which isn't bird food. That shell's too tough. Okay, but it was human food. If you hike around out in the bush, you see shell middens this high, just all over the place. What did we see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We saw 7 individuals this year. All right, and we haven't seen them. There were some in 97, and they've been gone since. And again, nobody really knows why. All right, someday we'll get somebody out there that can figure it out, but nobody has. We can make biodiversity maps. This is just number of species. Okay, this one's a little bit more interesting, which is another way of looking at number of species. But the green areas are average. The red areas are sort of hot spots, higher biodiversity. And the blue areas are kind of cold, lower biodiversity. And you can see that this area, again, the heavy mud, has pretty much the lowest biodiversity overall. So a lot of things seem to be tied to sediment size. This area in here and this area over here, we see very mixed sediment types as you're walking around. You'll be strolling on the surface, and then you'll sink down to your knees, and you'll crawl out of that, and you'll get up, and you got more varied habitat, you're going to have more varied critters. Okay? So we can start looking at some of these things. We also look at the birds. Okay, this was some data taken in 2000, looking at where they're roosting in red and where they're feeding in black. So these are red knots. A little picture of one down there. It looks like a brown wading bird with a little bit of red. We're looking at about 10 miles of commute to eat for these birds between where they roost and where they feed. You also notice they're feeding where that thin-shelled clam was that isn't there anymore. So this might not bode well. Okay? These birds are also more susceptible to disturbance because they've got a longer commute. Remember, the whole point of them being down here is to get fat. Being disturbed burns energy, makes you less likely to be able to make the trip. If we look at the gray-tailed tattler, they're roosting in the same area, but they're feeding all along the North Shore. It's the area where you get the most disturbance because you're closest to people, but your commute isn't as far. You can just push down the beach a little way. You're good. Then we look at, if I hit the right key, the great knots, which are actually roosting over a larger area and are feeding over a larger area. Probably not as worried about these guys. All right, they're probably pulling a more diverse food source. All right, and they're more diverse in terms of where they hang out at night. All right, so how do we turn all this into a park? You get a good story and you promote it, you promote it, you promote it. All right, the big story is the birds. All right, but to a lesser degree, the benthos. You know, people don't get as excited about it, but it is #1 in the world, hands down by almost 2 orders of magnitude, the most biodiverse mudflat in the world. Okay, it's unique. We've got a bit of a story. Now we just have to convince people. Well, you got to have the science. Well, or alternative facts. We've tried to stay away from those. We're trying to stick with facty facts. And that's where the science comes in. Because we got people doing their best to figure this out. We got people down there banding birds and GPSing them and sending them all over the world and doing all the bird stuff as well. All right? But you really can't make a good argument without data. That's where the science comes in. All right? But let's face it, nobody reads that stuff. All right? You know, if you get 20 reads, you're doing pretty well. Okay? And the locals in Broome, who are mostly a bunch of fried hippies, do not read peer-reviewed publications. Okay? So we've got to get it out to the public. You know, when somebody says, when the Park Service says, hey, let's make this a park, if the locals all say no, it's not going to happen. All right? If the locals all say, yeah, that'd be kind of cool, it can happen. But you've got to get the locals to that point. Okay? And I'm going to talk about some of our public outreach up there. Getting politicians in the mud is tough. But getting people from the Park Service, et cetera, out there really isn't. Okay? So we pull together anybody we can. All right? And much like here, if you can get the Native American tribes involved, that's a good thing. There, you get the Aboriginal tribes involved. You up your chances. Okay? So I put this together: inclusivity, continuity, and education within the research group itself. Really, it's about how do we keep this group going over 20 years scattered all over the world. Largely the same people are involved or sort of running it. That helps. When we go down there, we know what we're doing. You know, huge numbers of volunteers, and again, a lot of volunteers that have done it before. I'm going to talk about a few of those people. And there's also a lot of keeping everybody involved in what we're doing. It isn't sort of the scientists are over in this room doing science and the volunteers are out here digging ditches. Right? We've made a huge effort to keep everybody involved, kind of at all levels as we're going. Because ultimately everyone becomes an advocate for the Bay. We keep organized with this humongous whiteboard, and that's pretty much what's happening the next day to stay organized. That's Turnus. He's the guy with red knot subspecies named after him. Global Flyway Network. That was it. Hey, we have our own cooks. Those of you that have gone out in the field, you know, you don't have a student cooking sloppy joes one night and chili the next night and hot dogs the next night. And how many of you remember those trips? A couple of you, yeah. We even have consistent cooks. This was back in, I think it was 06. He was cooking for us this year. That's him right here. She's a local, shows up at every one, and she spends a month baking cookies before these things. You're out there sorting through little bugs, and at 4 o'clock, there's Helen with a plate of cookies. That plate of cookies shows up at about 10:30 in the morning for a little bit of morning tea. 100% volunteer, local, just been involved. And green tree frogs in the pot, because they're everywhere. This is actually one of the Dutch giving a talk about research in the Netherlands on mudflats, with the group hanging out. New blood and old. This was the going away. I was taking these two to the airport. Loisette she's the 88-year-old having her beer. How many of you know Stephen Glasby? That's his brother. I kid you not, he was involved up there. He was a math prof. His wife was a geology prof here for many years. And that's his brother Chris that I met in this research group in North, we're both sitting there jawing. He's like, yeah, my brother was in Central Washington. And, you kind of do the back and forth thing. It was like, wait a minute, Stephen and Marie? Yeah. So he's a worm expert. He's really nothing like Stephen, for those of you that know him. But he's kind of our new blood getting involved up there. And he teaches at Darwin U. There are all these community events. This was the Park Service doing some kind of hype for the bay. This is Mark, the Dutch guy that knows all the benthic invertebrates. We had a team that would spend all their time here. Fortunately, it wasn't me. This is like a little slice of horror. But they talked about the critters in the bay, and then they dragged everybody out onto the bay. Just headed down the beach and off into the mud. And, they were not collecting samples for us, but seeing what was out there. He's one of local, he works for the Park Service, local Aboriginal tribe. And, he's out there talking about whatever. Okay. I'm always amazed when I'm in Broome at how many people show up to these things. It's not a big town. The Broome Bird Observatory serves as a, clearinghouse maybe. They've always got stuff going on. Any birdo that drops by, you tell them all about this stuff. This was an evening community talk that apparently was pretty well attended. Some of the slides from today are actually from this talk. Okay. And then between expeditions, mostly you've got the locals. The bird banding is kind of always ongoing. The bird stuff is ongoing. We've got a monthly sampling. And again, we've got the bird observatory kind of keeping the hype up a little bit. Because let's face it, a bunch of people from the Netherlands and the US showing up every 6 years, who cares, right? But the locals keep things going. We've made a host of videos. This was the O2 one. It was shown on national TV. Just a short, 2-minute clip or something. But it was shown on national TV. All right. There was the one that was playing on loop when you came in. I can't imagine how much that camera costs, and he's out there kneeling in the mud. Okay. Yeah. And then a few extras. This was Brad's dad. He's a handyman from Yakima. This was his first trip out of Washington. And the dude could fix anything. He was amazing. Okay. Expedition leaders that share the dirty work. This has been something that a lot of the volunteers here have commented on. They mostly do bird stuff. And, this is the guy with species named after him with a headlamp picking bugs with everybody else. All right, this is the dean from Cambridge. This is the guy that organizes us. They're out there doing the same work. Like I said, we got norovirus through the camp once. Over half of us were sick. It was not fun. Everybody just kind of shrugged and worked through it. And a couple of days later, it worked its way through and everybody was back at it. We talked about canceling. We didn't. It ultimately didn't matter. Keeping your sense of humor. This was actually blessing one of our new leaders with the official sponge of shame. All right. Okay. There's the traditional mud fight that goes on. Yeah. Now, if you've got medical skills, every expedition in the world wants you. All right. The first few, we actually had an MD with us. This time, this is a dead stingray. Something about stingrays in Australia. Stay away. And they actually just cut the stinger off. They threw it in the sink with a bunch of plastic vials. The faucet broke. There's water spraying all over the place. Somebody reached into the sink, threw the plastic vials, and into his hand. All right, it's the first known sink-related stingray attack. Yeah. So in conclusion, how did we end up with a marine park? 2 of them. Well, we put together a large, diverse team. We had a good story. Educate, educate, educate. Talk about it. Convince people it's cool. Rinse, repeat. Do it again. You know, apply for money. Apply for protection. Go back to education. You know. And you know, it took 20 years, but we managed to succeed. Good sunset picture. What's next? Part of the mandated park monitoring. Now it's a park, they got to figure out what's going on. And they're going to have money as opposed to us scraping and scrounging. Grant's now muttering things about a World Heritage Site. It's already a Ramsar site, but World Heritage, why not? And I kind of roll my eyes and go, really? But hey, I said that about a marine park, so I probably ought to shut up. Or do we refocus on the rest of the flyway, particularly the Yellow Sea, which is a mess? Okay, a few acknowledgments, particularly of the graduate school and OISP here on campus. Everybody else that's funded us, a bunch of students, both from Curtin University and Central, that have headed down there over the years. The team, I got most of the photographs cited, but not all of them. And I'll just leave with the best of the sunset slides. Close.